Hello and welcome to Talking Hoosier History, brought to you by the Indiana Historical Bureau. For over a century, we've been marking Hoosier history. Now it's time to start talking Hoosier history. I'm Lindsay Beckley and I'll be your host. So it's no secret that Indiana's a basketball state. Basketball came to Indiana less than 2 years after it was invented in Springfield, Massachusetts, and since then it's become the most popular sport in the state by far. Every fall, Hoosier Hysteria sweeps the state during high school and college basketball tournament season, and we have 12 of the 15 largest gymnasiums in the nation. With all this attention on Indiana basketball, it's surprising how few people know the story of Bill Garrett and the integration of the Big Ten Basketball Conference. In this episode, I'll be talking about this often overlooked milestone of Indiana basketball history. Before we get started, I wanted to give a little disclaimer. We'll be quoting some excerpts from 1940s and 50s newspapers. Some of the language about race in these excerpts, while widely used in the country at that time, would not be acceptable today. Just know that we do not condone, nor would we typically use this language, but in the interest of preserving the historical authenticity of these sources, we have left them unchanged and uncensored. For me, the hardest part about telling any story in history is knowing where, and more importantly, when to begin. For example, how do you tell a story of the rise of Hitler in World War II without first talking about World War I and reparations, or the fall of the Roman Empire without talking about the rise of Christianity? And how do you tell a story about integration without starting with the story of segregation? And where does that story even begin? Does it begin with the African slave trade, the Civil War and Reconstruction, or maybe the First Great Migration? While all of these would be reasonable starting points, I'd be here all day talking about that if that's where I started. Since this story unfolds in the late 1940s and early 50s, I think I'll start in 1944, right at the height of American involvement in World War II. During his State of the Union address in January 1944, FDR said,
"But I do not think that any of us Americans can be content with mere survival. Sacrifices that we and our allies are making impose upon all of us a sacred obligation to see to it that out of this war, we and our children will gain something better than mere survival."
Something better than mere survival. For millions of African Americans who fought in the name of democracy and freedom in World War II, only to return home to face discrimination and segregation, that something better than mere survival for which they were striving for was simply equality. During this time in America, segregation was an ever-present aspect of life. Restaurants, movie theaters, buses, and housing, everything was segregated. A civil rights law had been passed in 1885 declaring that all persons were, quote, entitled to the full and equal accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of all places of public accommodation and amusement. This law was widely ignored, and segregation and discrimination continued. For instance, let's go to Bloomington, home of Indiana University. IU was considered a respected institution of higher learning as well as a cultural center. Even here, African American students face segregation. A 1940 report on the conditions of these students revealed that they were prohibited from living in university dorms, made to dine in a separate cafeteria, and were denied use of most of the facilities of the Union Building. And that was a gathering place for many of the white students at the time. As far as sports go, the track, football, and some of the other teams were already integrated in the 1940s, but not all squads accepted players on merit alone. The sports which banned African Americans were those that included a lot of exposed skin or physical contact. Swimming, wrestling, and basketball were included in these. For these sports, there existed a so-called gentleman's agreement among the coaches of the Big Ten Conference barring all black athletes. During the 1940s, more and more talented African American players were being passed up solely based on their race. The 1946 Indiana's Mr. Basketball winner, Johnny Wilson, went to Anderson University instead of any of the basketball powerhouse schools in the state. Other African American players turned to out-of-state schools for their collegiate careers. The fact that these top-ranked players weren't being recruited to the top-ranked schools was not missed by fans of the Hoosier State. One open letter published in the Hammond Times said,
"If the biggest, braggingest athletic conference in the middle of the greatest country in the world can use Negroes like Buddy Young, Ike Owen, Dallas Ward, Duke Slater, George Taliaferro, and the like to draw $200,000 crowds for football, and Negroes like Jesse Owens and Eddie Tolan to win Olympic crowns, why can't it use them in basketball?"
Another newspaper article asked,
"What in Hades is the matter with the Hoosier State when we are going to let one of our best basketball players of all time get away from us and go out to California to play? And all because of a ridiculous unwritten law that doesn't begin to make sense."
The pressure to break this so-called gentleman's agreement was mounting. 2 years earlier, African-American Richard Culbertson played varsity at the University of Iowa. But coaches largely regarded his participation as an exception rather than the rule, since he was a substitute rather than a starter, and wartime conditions made it more difficult to field a team. This time, there needed to be someone who would rewrite the rules. Into this picture enters Bill Garrett of Shelbyville High School. William L. Garrett was born in 1929 and grew up in Shelbyville, Indiana. Garrett learned the fundamentals of the game playing on the outdoor court behind the Booker T. Washington Elementary School, and later honed his abilities in the Paul Cross Gymnasium. By 1946, he was one of the star players on Shelbyville's varsity basketball team. After an appearance at Greencastle High School, Garrett was described as one of the smoothest performers and best shots to appear on the court over the years. During his senior year at Shelbyville, Garrett led the Golden Bears to the IHSAA state basketball title. Let's listen in on the semifinal game.
The state of Indiana, along the nation's hotbed of basketball, stages its 36th annual championship basketball tournament. The 22nd day of March 1947 finds Cage fans arriving from all sections of the state at the Butler University campus in Indianapolis. After some close guarding, Johnson bounces to Garrett, who shoots and makes good on a beautiful jump spin shot. It's 38-30, Shelbyville. Garrett tallies his last basket to make it 54 points for Shelbyville. He was fouled on the shot, and the Bears elect to take possession out of bounds. Garrett has scored 25 points to lead both teams in scoring. The gun fires. It's all over. Shelbyville will meet Terre Haute Garfield in the state finals at night. Shelbyville's Cinderella team went on to win the 1947 championship by a 68-58 victory over Garfield of Terre Haute. Now for some highlight scenes from the Shelbyville victory celebration.
For his ability on the court, he was selected as Indiana's Mr. Basketball. For his demeanor on and off the court, he was a co-recipient of the Paul Cross Award. This was a local honor awarded in short to that player who is at once a student, an athlete, and a gentleman. After Shelbyville's victory in the state championship, many wondered if and where Garrett would continue his basketball career. Would he have to leave the state to play? When one newspaperman asked where he was planning to go, he said, "I may go to UCLA or Southern California. That's what it looks like." Would he have to settle for a smaller, less notable basketball school like Johnny Wilson had done the previous year? Or would he just hang up his Converse for good? It's safe to say that the fans of Indiana basketball would not have been very happy with any of those outcomes. One reporter expressed the thoughts coursing through many Hoosiers' minds.
After all the medals and trophies are stored away, what then? Was it all moonglow? Was all the celebrating merely a moment of brotherhood in an eternity of intolerance?
To keep this from happening, and to blaze a path for other black players, Indianapolis African-American leaders banded together in order to persuade IU to give Garrett an opportunity to make the school's team. Spearheading this effort was Fabian DeFrance, executive director of the Senate Avenue YMCA in Indianapolis. He, along with other notable African Americans from Indy, drove down to Bloomington in the spring or summer of 1947 to meet with IU President Herman B. Wells on behalf of Garrett, who by this time was actually already in Tennessee gearing up to play for the historically black Tennessee A&I State University. In DeFrance's mind, Garrett was a great role model whose demeanor and basketball prowess would make him the perfect African-American hardwood pioneer. Wells was eager to end racial discrimination and segregation at the school, but wanted to do so quietly so as to prevent backlash. Wells met with DeFrance, who laid out the many merits of Garrett. He also dropped subtle hints towards the possibility of legal action if changes weren't made. After this meeting, Wells asked IU basketball coach Branch McCracken, a legend unto himself, to give Garrett a chance to make the team. Shortly thereafter, Garrett was called back from Tennessee and started classes at IU that fall. This transition was not without its issues. Some of the team's veterans were slow to warm up to Shelbyville, as he was sometimes called. During preseason practices, there were some small instances of discrimination, a wide-open pass to Garrett not taken, an extra hard elbow thrown here and there, but McCracken decided to allow his players to iron these problems out as they came. This was something Garrett would express appreciation for in an interview with the Indiana University Center for the Study of History and Memory in 1970.
Yeah, I think this was his approach to it, and I think as I look back on it, I thought possibly at times he probably should have came to my defense and straightened out maybe a player or two at times, but he didn't choose to do it. I didn't understand it at the time, but later I can see the wisdom in the way he reacted to various situations because of the fact that things did work out pretty good. Overall.
In December of 1948, Garrett made his regular season varsity debut and so became the first African-American player on an IU varsity basketball squad, and more importantly, as one article reported,
Garrett's entry into the Big Nine ranks may prove to be the beginning of the end for an anti-Negro gentleman's agreement.
Garrett quickly made a name for himself on IU's team. By the end of the season, Garrett had tallied 220 points, the highest total on the squad that season. Perhaps more important than that, though, his team had rallied around him in support throughout the season. Later in life, Garrett downplayed the discrimination he faced while playing at IU, saying in that same interview with the university,
Did you ever suffer any kind of discrimination?
Well, we didn't actually suffer any discrimination. Of course, having a Negro player presented problems, I would imagine, for the coach as far as dining room facilities. Many times it would be necessary for us to get a private room to eat in rather than, say, eat in a dining room in the various cities that we might go into, like Columbus, Ohio at that time. They probably had a policy that didn't make it possible to go into a restroom that they would normally go to. And then also at St. Louis, at that particular time, we would eat in rooms rather than stay in a dining room.
Now, when you say we, are you talking about the entire team?
Well, yes, it'd be the entire team. Arrangements, of course, being made by coaching.
While you can hear that he faced some discrimination, he mostly had fond memories of his time at IU. Perhaps this was partly due to the fact that his team supported him. If Garrett couldn't eat in a dining hall, they wouldn't either. If a hotel made him use the back steps, the whole team used the back steps. These acts of sportsmanship could only have bolstered his performance on the court. By the end of his first season on the varsity squad, one newspaper proclaimed him the most spectacular member of the team coached by Branch McCracken. The team's record improved greatly with Garrett on the squad, and by his senior year, IU was ranked 7th in the nation. By the time he graduated, he had broken both the career scoring record as well as a single-season scoring record, had been named to 2 All-American teams, was voted MVP by his own teammates, and came in second in the Big Ten's MVP poll. Garrett's effects on IU's basketball team are undeniable, but it's a bit more difficult to discern his influences on the rest of campus and the surrounding area. Progress was being made on and off the campus well before he arrived on the court, and continued to be made after he left. He was influential, don't get me wrong. His abilities on the court and his personality off of it made it a lot easier for people to accept his presence. One reporter commented on the effects of African American athletes on Hoosiers.
Race prejudice, too, has generally been given the bum's rush by the fans who lose sight of everything but the fortunes of our team. The performances of such athletes as Bill Garrett, Johnny Wilson, and a host of others have probably done as much as anything else to kill the Ku Klux Klan spirit in Indiana. A quick field goal by a Negro player will do more to convert the ordinary Hoosier than all the race relations days in a century.
Integration efforts had begun at IU well before Garrett's arrival on the scene. African American students at IU formed a local branch of the NAACP in early 1945 and made the admittance of black students to state-owned dormitories on campus their number one priority. They achieved this goal in 1949 during Garrett's first season on varsity. Other big strides were being made during his time at IU. By 1950, segregation in university cafeterias, university housing, Bloomington movie theaters, and honorary fraternities and sororities on campus had been addressed by the students and staff of IU. But it's really hard to know how much the integration of IU basketball had to do with these advances. What's easy to see is his influence on the makeup of the Big Ten Conference. An Indianapolis newspaper noted that,
following the path opened by Bill Garrett at Indiana University, sepia cagers are now making Big Ten and other leading reams in increasing numbers.
While he never played with or against another black player during his time in the conference, in the season after his graduation, at least 7 black basketball players made Big Ten teams. Though racial prejudice in sports did not end, black players continued to find success on Big Ten and other Midwest basketball teams. By 1958, at least 8 African Americans were starters in the Hoosier Classic, played between Purdue, Butler, Indiana, and Notre Dame. After serving in the Army during the Korean War, Garrett went on to play for the Harlem Globetrotters. Later, he began coaching at Crispus Attucks High School in Indianapolis. He led the team to a state title in 1959. That year, he became the first African American to be named Coach of the Year in Indiana, and in 1974, he was inducted into the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame. Just 3 months later, he passed away on August 7, 1974. This year, the Indiana Historical Bureau is proud to be a part of the dedication of a state historical marker commemorating the integration of IU basketball and Bill Garrett's story. Once again, I'm Lindsay Beckley, and this has been Talking Hoosier History. I'd like to thank some people who made this podcast possible. A big thank you goes out to Tom Graham and Rachel Graham Cody, authors of Getting Open, the unknown story of Bill Garrett and the integration of college basketball. Casey Pfeiffer, our historical marker manager, Jill Weiss, our recording engineer, and finally Justin Clark, who works with Hoosier State Chronicles and has been acting as our newspaper announcer. Before we go, let's hear from him one more time, reading from the Indianapolis Recorder.
Such matters as politics, international affairs, economics, and even religion are often taken lightly by Indiana people. But when it comes to basketball, they are in grim, deadly earnest. Prejudices are not allowed to stand in the way of a winning team.